Though it's not universally true, most art in the latter half of the 20th century and into the early 20th century, 21st century, are primarily centered in the United States. And as we get closer to the turn of the 21st century, that starts to become less true. And I don't mean necessarily that there is no art elsewhere in the world, but that the sort of perspective of modern and postmodern art is really happening in America at this point. There are certainly art forms emerging as we get into the 21st century elsewhere, but modern art tends to focus on kind of what's happening in the US at this time. So one of the big styles in the latter part of the 20th century, so they're talking about the late 1950s into the 1960s, after abstract expressionism, is the pre-pop art movement. And there are two major artists in this, Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns, both of whom bring back the concept of found objects, which we saw with Marcel Duchamp at the beginning of the 20th century. A lot of their art hints at Americana or modern pop culture. They also use aspects of collage to layer in texture the way that cut paper often does. So you end up with these very three-dimensional canvases. They include paint, but also images like photographs like these here. There is a reproduction of Sandro Botticelli's Venus right here, newspaper print, popular sporting images, drawn images down here. So there's a lot of things that come together to create one sort of giant collaged image. He also works in three-dimensional sculpture, again with found objects. So monogram, he actually found a tire and created out of a mop and some found pieces this ram that goes in the middle. The base that it's on is on wheels. It's textured with real wood. There's again print on it, paint. So a lot of different aspects that he puts together into one sort of seemingly nonsensical, but an image that sort of comes together into a unified space. Jasper Johns in particular likes to deal with sort of American culture. So in Target with Plaster Casts, we have these casts that he made of body parts, mouths, ears, noses, hands, etc. And then this target that he has painted onto the middle of it. And at the top here, these little wooden blocks can actually come down and close over the different pieces, as if when you hit a target, a different thing is checked off. He also creates numerous images out of the American flag. And so in this case, the American flag becomes a found object as well as a pop culture reference. So if you think back to the way that the Mona Lisa was used by Duchamp as something that people would already have a connotation with and would already understand, Johns is doing the same thing with the American flag. It creates patriotism, it references the country, it talks about where this art form is actually happening, and he reproduces it multiple times. So in this one, it's layered, 3 flags on top of one another. He has other ones that are just an individual flag. He's essentially celebrating America while also talking about the sort of prolific nature of our own country's imagery. From there, we get into the actual pop art style, which pretty much exclusively pulls from popular culture. This is a style of art that exists both in the United States and in Britain. There's a large pop art movement there as well. Roy Lichtenstein is an American who uses imagery that looks like it comes from comic books. So in Wham, these are actually 2 very large panels of the same painting. They take up an entire wall in a gallery and are painted meticulously to look like they might have come out of a newspaper. So if you look up close, you'll see the lines that might come from printing. Often you see dots that are associated with the way that newspapers would have been printed at this time period in the 60s. And then these kind of cartoon-like images that are very popular in newspaper comic books. We also have Andy Warhol, who is probably the best known of the pop artists. Andy Warhol essentially saw everything as a ready-made pop culture piece that he could pull from. So he uses a lot of objects that are a part of the sort of consumer culture in America. So Coca-Cola bottles here, Campbell's soup cans, soap boxes, any number of products that he might have found and really wants to exploit their mass production aspect. He also uses celebrities or well-known historical figures as commodities as well. So here we have a picture of Mao Zedong. He uses Marilyn Monroe, Elvis. He's also sort of fascinated by sort of sometimes death and danger and the sort of the hardness that comes from being a celebrity and being so in the public, which is something that he feels himself. He is at some point shot by a fan of his who gets into his workspace, which he calls the factory, an intentional name, so it looks more like a place of mass production than an art studio. She shoots him, he survives, but then eventually ends up with having a surgery that is complicated from his previous gunshot wound and eventually kills him. So there is kind of a darkness to his art, and this fascination with consumer culture and this idea that everyone gets their 15 minutes of fame. Klaus Oldenburg is a pop art sculptor. You might recognize this if you've been in downtown Center City, Philadelphia, the giant clothespin. Oldenburg takes regular everyday objects and then makes them into giant sculptures so that they really sort of invade your space and really make you look at them from a new perspective. So the clothespin is one. There's a giant hamburger called Floor Burger. You have to walk around it. It takes up a very large portion of a room in an art gallery. So again, nothing really unusual, but objects that you would recognize and then would be a little bit off-put by how much larger than life they really are. There are also artists who deal with something called hard edge painting. It's kind of an offshoot of color field where you have these sort of solid blocks of color and then they use meticulous lines. It's minimal. It doesn't say a whole lot. Again, the titles often have very little to do with what the pictures are actually of, but they are challenging. They do show a high level of skill in the way that they're actually painted. And this leads into something called minimalism. Minimalism is a really big style in the 60s and 70s. It is really designed to keep the artist out of the image. It's a reaction against emotional styles like abstract expressionism and the saturated imagery of pop art. So instead of putting yourself into the image or putting recognizable images onto the canvas or into your art, minimalists kind of pull away from that and they use simple shapes and forms and colors. They also use really modern materials such as acrylic, neon, steel, things that come from the modern world. So Donald Judd has this series of stacking blocks on the wall. It's three-dimensional. You'd walk around it. They have a version of this in the Princeton Art Museum if you've ever gone there or ever do. Dan Flavin works in neon light. So he creates these sort of geometric forms out of neon. Carl Andre works in a lot of metals. So here we have 144 magnesium squares that are put onto the floor of the art museum. You can actually walk around it because these are industrial materials. You don't have to be careful the way you do with your traditional types of sculpture. Another sort of pushback to minimalism, but also to the way that painting has moved in this part of the 20th century away from pictorial images, is a style called photorealism. So photorealism means a painting that is so close to reality that it looks like a photograph. Chuck Close is a really big leader of the photorealist movement. So what you're looking at here is not actually a photograph. It is a painting that Chuck Close did of himself. And if you were standing in front of it, you'd be able to see some of the paint, but he has so carefully blended the paint together on the canvas that it is almost impossible to tell that this is a painted image and not a photo. He gets things like the little swirl of smoke from his cigarette, the reflection of light in his glasses, shadows from his hair and other things in the room, the texture of his skin. So it is really a hyper-real image. And it tries to make the point that there is still space for painting at this time in art. That just because the canvas has been abstracted doesn't mean that there isn't a place for representational imagery at this point. We also see artists using their art for performance in some capacity. Cindy Sherman is a photographer who actually uses her own body as kind of the canvas that she creates these scenes around. So she does a number of different series. This one is from her film still series, where she essentially plays different sort of Hollywood types that are often seen in films. So you have the sort of glamorous housewife here. There's something about her that seems a little bit threatened. There's in the mirror here a reflection of a glass with a drink in it. So maybe there's somebody else in the space. Her expression tells us maybe she's a little bit frightened. But we also can tell she's wealthy. She's getting ready to go out. And then over here we have in Untitled Film Still number 21, a woman on the street in New York. She looks like, again, she might be nervous about something. If anybody has ever seen Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, she sort of reminded me of the figure just as she's noticing the birds and getting ready to run into a phone booth. So Sherman does a lot of these paintings where or photographs, where she says that they are not self-portraits. They are designed to allow people to see themselves or else types of women, or ways that women are typecast within these images. She has other series that have to do with famous paintings. She has others that are like famous wealthy society women in New York. That's one of her more recent series. But she's been working in this style for a very long time. If you're ever interested in learning more about her, there's a fantastic video with her on PBS's Art 21. I would definitely watch that if you can. And finally, I wanted to end with the 1980s, which is a really good point because after that point we get into very contemporary art, which is a lot harder to contextualize because it's still evolving. But in the art of the 1980s, we have noticed that pop art and abstract expressionism and minimalism have all become really pervasive in society. They're everywhere. Everyone knows about them at this point. They're kind of expected. And they're also signs of kind of high-minded art for people who have access to museums, people who have really the money to invest in art, to collect it. And then we have artists like Keith Haring and Jean-Michel Basquiat, who are both originally street artists and want to make art that is accessible to everybody. They pull from the history of art. They're definitely informed. They understand where art comes from. They have training. But they reject traditional art forms. So Haring got his start in the subways in the 1980s. There used to be these black pieces of paper on the subway walls when they were getting ready to put up a new ad. And Haring would come through with a piece of chalk, and he would draw these really simple outline figures. And they would usually be pretty poignant. This one talks about apartheid in South Africa. And people started to notice them around the city. And because it was art that you could see everywhere. And it was for art for people who were not necessarily in the museums or the art galleries and collecting. People eventually started taking these off the walls of the subway. And as Keith Haring became better known, he opened a shop where people could buy his art in kind of every kitsch form possible. So the little cinescopes like you can get on the beach, keychains, mugs, a lot of the things that you might find today in an art museum gift shop, he would actually create so that his art could be used and touched in a part of the world. Basquiat also started as a street artist. He would originally tag his art Samo, S-A-M-O, with a little crown and a copyright symbol. And Samo was his street tag. It stood for same old shit. And a lot of his art was a commentary on the way that the art world operated. He was critical of it, but at the same time kind of wanted to be accepted by it. He was interested in becoming successful. He was fascinated by the concept of fame. And his art really pulls from the world around him. So he was quite well educated. He was really into jazz, Dizzy Gillespie. He references history a lot. There are forms that he references that have to do with really traditional subjects in art. And yet his art was often deemed by the critics as primitive, which was really a negative way for Basquiat to be perceived in his own estimation, because it really denigrated him down to something very simplistic. And what he was actually doing was quite complex. He flattened the canvas, he flattened the image. His art was very influenced by street style at this point, but the art world was trying to put him into the context of the history of art that we've been talking about. And he didn't really make sense from that perspective. So he became a really big sensation very quickly. Within just a couple of years, he was making millions of dollars on his paintings. But the art world still did not really accept him as the artist that he truly was, which was really innovative.